The morning he got everything he ever wanted was the morning I had already decided to burn it all down, and he had no idea. I remember standing in the kitchen, bare feet on that cold limestone tile Tabena had insisted on when we renovated, my coffee going lukewarm in a mug that said, World's Best Nurse, even though I hadn't set foot in a hospital in 3 years. 3 years. The length of time it takes to unlearn yourself so completely that you stop noticing the woman in the mirror looks like a stranger wearing your skin. His name was Tabena Achike. Mine is Zuri Ose Mensa. Though I hadn't written it that way in years, I'd been Zuri Achike so long I'd almost forgotten the Ose Mensa part existed, like a middle name you stop using by the time you hit middle school. I was 36. I had a master's degree in clinical nursing I wasn't using, a garden I tended with obsessive precision because it was the only living thing I could still control, and a marriage that had been running on fumes and routine since sometime around the third year. We'd been together 11 years total, married for 7. I want you to understand something before I keep going, because people always assume they know what kind of story this is going to be, and they're almost always wrong. This is not a story about a bad man. Tabena Achike was not cruel. He was not a cheater, at least not in the way that word usually lands. He was not someone who hit or degraded or screamed. He was, in every way that the world could observe and measure, a good husband. Attentive enough, generous enough, present enough. Enough is a terrible word to build a life around. I'd been carrying a secret for 4 months when that day arrived. 4 months and 11 days to be exact, because I'd started counting from the morning I sat in Dr. Nina Sofala's office and she handed me a pamphlet about options, and I'd driven home in silence with my hands steady on the wheel and something in my chest cracked clean open. Not breaking, opening. Like a window that had been painted shut for years finally giving way. The secret wasn't what you're thinking. I wasn't pregnant. I wasn't having an affair. I wasn't sick, at least not in a way that showed up on labs. I had been accepted to a fellowship in Edinburgh, a clinical research fellowship, 18 months, full funding, housing stipend. My mentor from graduate school, Dr. Adesua Prempe Yaw, had nominated me without telling me, and the letter had arrived in my email like a ghost from the life I used to be building. I'd applied 3 years earlier, before the wedding, and been waitlisted. They'd come back around. They'd come back to me. I hadn't told Tabena. 4 months. 4 months of lying next to him in the dark and doing the math. Of walking through our shared routines. Sunday agusi soup, Wednesday gym nights, his soccer games on Saturday mornings that I stopped attending 2 years in, and trying to locate the version of myself that had been willing to set aside Edinburgh the first time. Trying to understand how I'd done it so quietly, so without drama, that I hadn't even heard myself do it. That morning, a Tuesday in late October, I was in the garden by 7. The sky above Croydon was doing that specific Southern English thing where it can't decide between overcast and attempting brightness, hovering in a pewter gray that made everything look slightly underwater. My dahlias were on their way out, the last of the season, blooms called Café Olay, which is a deeply uninspiring name for something that color, that complex, blush layered over rust, over cream, with petals that curled inward like they were keeping something private. I was deadheading them when my phone buzzed. They said yes, starting Monday. Also, got the car. Come outside when you're home. I stood there in the garden with the dead blooms in my hands and read it 3 times. The job. He'd been interviewing for 6 weeks with a fintech firm in Canary Wharf, director of product, a title that had lived in his mind since his mid-20s, like a destination he'd been driving toward on a road that kept extending. The salary was extraordinary. The title was everything. He'd wanted this so badly that in the final week before the decision, I'd watched him check his email 40 times a day, watched him go quiet at dinner in a way that wasn't quite present. And the car. He talked about a particular car, a Maserati Grecale, deep navy, leather interior and tan, the way some people talk about places they want to visit someday. Theoretical, a marker of arrival. We'd had one conversation about it 6 months ago where I'd said, that's a real car, and he'd laughed and said, not yet, and the subject closed. Not yet, apparently, had become now. I went inside, I washed my hands, I changed out of my gardening clothes and into something that didn't have soil on it, and I drove to the office supply store on the high street, and I printed 12 pages on their machine for 48 pence. And I came home and sat at the dining table that we'd found at an estate sale in Kent and refinished together the first year we were married, and I placed the papers in a neat stack in the center of it. Then I made another pot of coffee and I waited. He came home at 6:30. I heard the unfamiliar sound of the engine, quieter than our old Volvo, more authority to it, and I heard him come in through the front door with the specific energy of someone who has arrived somewhere they've been trying to get to for a long time. Zuri. He said my name the way he used to, when we first started dating, like it meant something specific. Did you see it? I heard it, I said. Congratulations. He came into the dining room and stopped when he saw the papers. I want to tell you exactly what his face did in that moment, because it was the most honest I'd seen him in years, maybe ever. Every layer of his public self stripped clean in about 2 seconds. He went from lit up to confused to something I can only describe as the specific terror of a person who has been moving so fast they didn't notice what they were leaving in their wake. What is this? He said, not a question. The way you say something when you already know what it is, but you need a moment before you can let it be true. Separation papers, I said. I had a solicitor draw them up. They're fair. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable. He sat down. He didn't pick them up. He just sat across from me at the table we'd refinished together and looked at me like I was a weather event. I don't understand, he said. I know, I said. That's part of the problem. Here is what I want to say about the conversation that followed, which lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes and covered territory I'd been navigating in my own mind for years while he was busy navigating the fintech industry. I am not going to make him the villain. He wasn't. That's the complicated part. That's the part that took me 3 years and an Edinburgh fellowship and 4 months of insomnia to find my way to. Because it would be so much easier if someone had done something unforgivable. So much neater. The story writes itself when there's a villain. What had happened instead was something quieter and more corrosive. What had happened was this. When I'd been waitlisted for Edinburgh the first time, I told him about it in a way that I now understand was a test I hadn't consciously constructed. I'd said, I got waitlisted, it's fine, we're getting married anyway. And he had said, that's disappointing, I'm sorry. And then we had talked about the wedding venue. And that was it. That was the whole conversation. He hadn't asked what I wanted to do if I got off the wait list. He hadn't asked whether we could make it work. He hadn't offered anything except sympathy, which is not the same thing as support, which is not the same thing as partnership. And I hadn't pushed. I'd folded Edinburgh up like a map and put it away, and he had been relieved. I could see that now, in retrospect, I could see the relief, because it was simpler, because the architecture of our life was easier to build around one person's ambition than two. Whose fault is that? I've stopped trying to assign it. Fault is the wrong unit of measurement for what happens when two people both fail to say the thing that needs saying. You're leaving for Edinburgh, he said near the end of the 4 hours. It wasn't a question anymore. He'd read the fellowship letter I'd included with the papers. Yes. And if I asked you not to go? You'd be asking me to do something I already did once, I said. And I think we both know how that went. He was quiet for a long time. The Maserati was in the driveway. His dream job started Monday. He was, by every metric he'd been chasing, exactly where he'd wanted to be. And sitting across the estate sale table from the woman he'd been married to for 7 years, with her Edinburgh papers in front of him, and the realization settling in that the person he thought he knew had been somewhere else entirely for a long time, he looked, for the first time, genuinely lost. I'm not glad he was in pain. I want to be clear about that, but I am honest enough, finally, to say that there was something in seeing him lost that felt like the first true thing between us in years. We were both, finally, in the same room. I left for Edinburgh on a Wednesday in December, 6 weeks later. My garden I left in the care of my neighbor, Blessing Ufuoma Carr, a retired secondary school headmistress with opinions about dahlias that are almost entirely correct. She promised to overwinter the tubers properly. I believed her. I packed 2 suitcases, which felt like both too much and not enough. Tabena drove me to Heathrow. We decided in those 6 weeks on something that doesn't have a clean name, not quite separated, not yet divorced, not together in any way that was functional, but also not nothing. He'd asked if he could drive me, and I'd said yes because I wasn't cruel either, and also because I thought the drive might give us something. It did, though not what I expected. We were on the M4, past Chiswick, when he said, "Do you remember the first thing you ever said to me?" I did. We'd met at a mutual friend's birthday party in Brixton, 2013. I'd been standing near the window with a glass of something warm and fizzy, and he'd come to stand beside me and said I read somewhere that people who stand near windows at parties are either the most interesting people in the room or they've lost someone recently. And I'd looked at him and said, "What if it's both?" "You said, 'What if it's both?'" Tabena said. I knew right then. Knew what? That you were someone who contained a lot more than you were going to show me on the first go. I watched the motorway unreel ahead of us, the gray English morning unchanged from the pewter of October, perennial, reliable in its ambiguity. "You were right," I said. "I know," he said. I don't know how to." He stopped, started again. "I got good at loving the parts of you I could see. I don't think I ever got good at asking about the rest. It is possible to be furious with someone and to love them simultaneously. It is possible to be leaving and still feel the weight of what you're carrying away from something. It is possible to be all at once grieving and relieved and terrified and more yourself than you've been in years. I didn't say any of this in the car. Some things you keep. He dropped me at departures. We didn't hug for very long, just enough, exactly enough, which was its own kind of sentence. "Tell me how the Dahlias do," he said. "They'll be fine," I said. "Blessing knows what she's doing." Edinburgh in December is not gentle. The city does not soften itself for arrivals. It sits there on its volcanic rock with its medieval spine and its wind that comes off the firth with a particular personality, as if the weather itself has an opinion about whether you've earned the right to be there. The streets in the old town are not forgiving streets. They were not built for comfort. They were built for survival, for the stubbornness of people who decided to live somewhere that would kill them if they stopped paying attention. I arrived on a Wednesday. I walked from the taxi through the stone archway of the building where my fellowship housing was located. 17th century, apparently, though it had been renovated in ways that involved decent insulation and a modern kitchen. And I stood for a moment in the entrance hall with my 2 suitcases, and I did not cry. I had expected to cry. I'd braced for it the whole flight, the way you brace for turbulence that's been announced in advance, tensing yourself against something that doesn't come on schedule. Maybe at Heathrow, maybe in the taxi, watching the city come up through the dark. But I hadn't, and I didn't. And standing in that entrance hall under a ceiling that had been holding itself up for 400 years, what I felt instead was something that took me 3 days to find the right word for. Arrival. Not the polite, procedural arrival of someone who has come somewhere for a conference or a holiday or any of the temporary visitations that leave no mark. The older kind of arrival. The kind that means, I am a person who has gotten somewhere. I felt something, though. Something that had no clean name either, underneath the arrival. A grief that was not quite grief. A relief that was not quite relief. That hybrid weather state of major transitions that doesn't have its own vocabulary because most people don't stay still long enough to name it. I thought about the word zuri, which means beautiful in Swahili, and which my mother had given me with such specific intention, not because she thought beauty was the thing to aspire to, but because she told me once that she chose it in the sense of whole, of everything functioning, of a thing that has not been diminished. She was a woman who chose her words with deliberate architecture, my mother. She was a woman who believed that naming was a form of accountability, that what you called something determined, in part, what it could become. I think of her every time someone says my name carelessly, which is often. Standing in the entrance hall, I said my own name quietly, the way she used to say it. Zuri Ose Mensa. All of it. The whole thing. It felt like remembering. The fellowship work was hard, and it was real, and it was mine. My supervisor was a researcher named Dr. Cormac Ofiek, who had the bearing of a person who had spent 40 years being severely unimpressed by nonsense and had arrived at a kind of luminous impatience. He did not suffer inexact thinking. He did not believe in easing anyone into anything. On my third day, he handed me a data set on sepsis management and post-ICU recovery outcomes in West African patients and said, "Tell me what you see." I told him. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Right, good, don't lose that." Which I understood to mean, there's something in the way you think that's worth keeping. Don't let Edinburgh talk you out of it. I found over the months that followed that I was good at the work in ways I'd forgotten I could be good at anything. Not performing goodness, actually good in the way where you finish a day tired, but with the specific tiredness of someone who has used something real. My clinical eye hadn't rusted the way I'd feared. It had been sitting there, all that time in Croydon, deadheading dahlias and letting itself go dormant, waiting. I spoke with Tabena occasionally, not often, carefully. The conversations had a different texture than they ever had when we were married, more honest, which is one of the more devastating ironies of some endings. We spoke in December, briefly, on the winter solstice, because we had always marked the solstice together, and neither of us had decided not to yet. We spoke in February, when his mother's health wobbled and I called because I knew Adeze Achike, and I cared about her genuinely, separate from everything else. We spoke in April, when the divorce was finalized, and that conversation was short and carried the weight of everything we'd never managed to say with any precision. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm becoming something," I said. "I think that counts." He laughed a little. "That sounds like you." "I'm working on that," I said. My dahlias, when I came back the following June, briefly between phases of the fellowship, staying at a sublet in Peckham while Tabena had moved to a flat in Bermondsey, had overwintered beautifully. Blessing Ufoma Carr, as I'd suspected, had done everything correctly. The garden was not mine anymore. The house had been sold as part of the settlement. But Blessing let me come and see what she'd done with the beds, and I stood there in the June morning, warmer than Edinburgh, softer light, the particular green of South London in early summer, and I looked at the Café au lait dahlias that were just beginning to show buds for the season ahead, and something unclenched in me. Not everything. I want to be precise about that. Not everything unclenched. There was still grief there, real grief, because you don't spend 7 years building something with another person and leave clean. You leave carrying pieces. You will always be carrying pieces. But beneath the grief, or alongside it, or threaded through it, I'm not sure spatial metaphors quite capture the architecture of what I mean. There was something solid, something load-bearing. I'd spent 3 years standing in a kitchen, going lukewarm in a mug, and now I was standing in a June garden, and I was on my way back to Edinburgh, and my name was Zuri Ose Mensah, and I was not finished. That's the thing no one tells you. Maybe because it seems too simple. Maybe because it sounds like a fortune cookie sentiment when it is actually the most demanding thing in the world. You are not finished. You are not a thing that gets finished. Tabena had gotten his dream. The job, the car, the title, all of it, same evening. I had handed him divorce papers. And the thing that I know now that I didn't know in the limestone kitchen with my lukewarm coffee is that I wasn't taking anything from him. I was just finally taking myself. The dahlias were going to be extraordinary that year. You could tell from the buds, the way they held themselves, tight in particular, keeping something private. They always knew what they were doing. If this story moves something in you, like it, share it, subscribe. You deserve more of this.